I'm joined now on the sofa by Dr. Nathan Hall, and Nathan and I are going to be talking a little bit about planning and writing your dissertation. Now we're going to swap things around a little bit, and Nathan's going to be in charge of asking all the tricky questions. So Nathan, over to you.
Well, good morning everybody, thanks for watching. Okay, so obviously the dissertation series is one of the key things that our students undertake, and it's probably one of the most anxiety-provoking things, yes. I think. And one of the questions that we quite often get is, I've got this idea about what I want to do for my dissertation, but I have no idea how to turn it into a question or something that's manageable for research. How do you go about making that link between an idea and turning it into a research question?
And that's often the hardest bit, I think, about writing the dissertation. Once you've got that research question, I think it then becomes a much more logical process of writing and planning the dissertation after that. So that's one of the biggest jobs, and I think probably the most important thing to do when moving from idea to research question is to read.
Yeah.
So, a real attack on the research literature, because you can have an idea that I want to do something on the security industry perhaps, or I want to do something on countering fraud, but in order to get to the specifics, you need to understand what the problems are. Now, obviously our students will have been through level 4 and level 5, so they'll have a good idea of the subject area, but if they want to look a bit more specifically at exactly what the literature is saying on that particular area, I think that's really important. So read to try to narrow the area down, and it's really important that it is narrowed down, that it's not everything that I know about the security profession, because although students will often think that 10,000 words is a huge amount to write, once that's broken down into individual chapters, it then becomes much more difficult, and you've been doing this for many years as well, and there's never a student that says I can't quite get beyond 6,000 words.
No, one of the really interesting things that comes around all the time is at the outset students saying, well, I don't know how I'm going to write 10,000 words about this, and then you get a month into the process and it's, I don't know how I'm going to keep it down to 10,000 words.
I've got 18,000.
Yeah, so that narrowing down is really important.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And not writing everything about a particular topic as well, so really starting to focus and maybe adding some variables in as well. So if you're looking at say, for example, public perceptions of the police, you might want to add a variable in, so look at a specific age group, for example, or a specific ethnic group, or a specific vulnerable group, to see whether that makes a difference to public perceptions of policing. So rather than looking at the whole topic, try to narrow that focus.
Absolutely, I agree entirely with that. Okay, so one of the things I always advise my students to do at the outset is to go and have a look at dissertations in the library and get a feel for what they look like. And invariably the question that comes back, having done that, is they all look different. And there's no set way, or doesn't seem to be a set way of doing it. So what that indicates is that there are different types of dissertation. Can you say a few words about the different types that students could do?
Yes, definitely. And it is a good idea that you're sending your students away, I think, to look at different types of dissertations, because often students will say, what does a dissertation look like? And they almost want a template for it. But as you say, there are many, many different ones. And importantly, I think, it's important that students know that no one type of dissertation is better than another type of dissertation. Doing a particular type will not get you a better mark than doing another type. So I suppose just generally, I would say there are 4 different types. You may want to think there are others. Primary research would be one of the first ones, where you're actually going out and doing some research. Clearly you need to get ethical approval for that, so discussion with your supervisor at an early stage would be very opportune. But primary research is going out and doing some research out there in the public, or in your workplace, for example, that might be relevant. Secondary research is another that you could look at, where you're analysing research that's already been done, but perhaps in a different way. So you might be taking crime statistics that are already out there, but applying them in a different way. Looking at them, analysing them in a different way. Or you might want to look at newspaper reports, for example, and analyse them that way. So it's research that's already been done, but you're perhaps taking that research and analysing it and looking at it in a different way. A third one that I like that students don't use all that often is case study, case study approach. I had a student a few years ago who did something on drug mules in Jamaica, but her dissertation as a whole was on situational crime prevention. But then she was looking in particular, one chapter, which looked at drug mules in Jamaica. So it's not a whole dissertation on that area, but it's a case study. You could do that on a murder investigation, for example. And then finally, and not to be ignored, is the literature review, which students often think, well, I can't just do a literature review, it won't get me as good marks as doing primary research, but that's just simply not true. A real in-depth look at the literature that's already been published, but analysed, but with your own specific research question. So I think that's probably most of them.
I think so, and I think we've briefly talked so far about the issue of the research question and the type of dissertation. I think the thing that I would say to students is that when you're thinking about your idea, your research question, your structure, this is not something you have to do by yourself. You should make the most of your supervisor to help you engage with that process.
Absolutely.
Because actually that sets the scene for what follows.
Yeah, and really early contact with your supervisor as well, because these early decisions, as you know, are the most important ones, aren't they? What type of dissertation am I going to do? Do I need ethical approval for it? How do I structure this dissertation? Those decisions are absolutely crucial, and if you don't have the support of your supervisor at that stage, you may be going off down the wrong road.
So you waste a lot of time with that.
Absolutely. Really early contact with your supervisor.
Absolutely, and I'd absolutely encourage everybody to get in touch with your supervisors as soon as you can. Okay, so different types, but how do you structure a dissertation?
And that's often the next tricky bit as well,
is.
isn't it? And some students, I think that you write 10,000 words in just a long section, but you break it down. And I often say that it's a good idea to think of a dissertation a bit like the old egg timers. I was going to bring one, but I haven't, because I think there are some students out there who probably don't know what an egg timer is. The things that had sand in them that you would turn over, and it would be a 3-minute timer with the sand dropping through. But the shape is the important thing of the egg timer. And I think that gives an indication of how you approach a dissertation, that you start off quite broad. So if you're looking at something specific like some fraud legislation, you might want to just make it a bit broad to start with by looking at fraud as a whole. Imagine your reader, as we often say, is a sort of intelligent teenager and that they don't particularly know the area. So keep it broad to start with, narrow your focus towards the middle of your dissertation in those middle chapters, but then broaden it out again towards the end where you answer the sort of so what question. How does this matter? How is this analysis that you've done of this particular area, how is that relevant more broadly within the criminal justice sector, for example?
Absolutely.
So I think that shape is quite a good one to remember.
Yeah, and setting out very clearly at the beginning what the problem is that you are seeking to examine, I think, is really, really important. And I would always encourage my students to think about that in their first chapter, about what are the issues that we are seeking to address in all of this.
Because before, like you say, before you can address the problems, you need to know what the problem is. And you've got to remember that your reader, even though they probably are an expert in the area, you've got to imagine that your reader isn't. So you can't outline the solutions to the problems until you've outlined what the problem is.
Absolutely. And I think it's always helpful that you'll know that you'll have 2 people who will mark your dissertation, and obviously we try to allocate somebody who is an expert in the field that you're studying. So I always encourage my students to think, well, you're not writing for your supervisor, you're writing for the second marker, the person who's going to mark it, who may not be an expert in that field, but will have an interest nevertheless.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about structures of dissertations, and you and I are both very good at telling students or advising students or helping them with the structure.
Yeah.
But can we do it on the spot? Here's the question. I've got a handful of titles here that I'm going to give to you, and I'm going to ask you to tell us what you would do in terms of creating a structure.
Great. And they're all areas I know a lot about, are they?
No, not at all. But this is to illustrate that there are principles and themes.
Okay.
Let's see how we go, shall we?
Okay.
Ready?
Good. Structure on the spot.
Okay. So the first one, and I will pass it to you so you can refer.
Okay.
Benefit fraud, a symptom of anomie or just greed?
Fraud. Okay. Benefit fraud, a symptom of anomie or just greed. Okay, so the first thing is to break it down.
Yep.
So you probably wouldn't have a title at the start, would you? You'd have more of an area, but anyway. So this dissertation, therefore, wants to look at 3 different things in a way. It's looking at fraud, but it's looking specifically at benefit fraud, and it's looking at the causes of that related to criminological theory, and there's a mention of anomie here. So I would suggest a 3-chapter dissertation. I would always suggest for an undergrad dissertation either 3 or 4 chapters, really. I would suggest a 3-chapter one for this, so that maybe you would start off by talking about fraud generally, as I said, that broad thing. But towards the end of that first chapter, you'd narrow it down and start talking about benefit fraud, so that you're starting that narrowing, that funneling already. Your second chapter would therefore need to talk about the criminological theories that are relevant. You don't want to talk about all of them, but you'd want to, because that's a PhD in itself.
It is.
But you'd want to focus on those that are specifically relevant to fraud. So you'd be looking at situational type theories, but also you'd be looking at anomie, because that's in the title. So by the end of chapter 2, you've dealt with fraud and benefit fraud, you've dealt with the relevant criminological theories. Your third chapter would then be applying those 2 together and analysing them together. So what we know about benefit fraud, what we know about criminological theories, can the theories explain the fraud in your analysis and discussion in chapter 3?
Sounds good. And of
Did
course,
I
we'd be
pass?
looking to do that in a balanced way, wouldn't we? To make sure that, you know, we were looking not just for the strengths of the theory, but also the weaknesses and any gaps that might be identified within within that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now
Okay.
that's a literature review.
Mm-hmm.
If you were going to do that as primary research and you were going to talk to perhaps people who had been convicted of benefit fraud, or perhaps the perceptions of people who work within benefit fraud, that could then be an additional chapter where you sought their views. But that wouldn't mean that you wouldn't still need those early literature chapters that would be setting the scene before you then went on to do your own research.
And then, of course, you'd need a chapter really that talks about your methodology, or somewhere a discussion about your methodology and your ethical approval, which you will have got in order before you do any research.
Yes.
And then we go from there. Okay, well, since you did so well on that one,
Oh, good.
let's try another one, shall we? Okay, right. Let's go for intelligence-led policing in Austria. Are they there yet?
I actually supervised this dissertation. Have you?
Shall I have it back then?
No. I think these must be titles from previous students, which is great. And I did supervise this student. And this was a very interesting one because he worked in the area, but there wasn't a lot of literature on intelligence-led policing in Austria. So that was, in a sense, his job. It didn't matter that there wasn't literature on the specific area that he wanted to look at. He could go away and find the literature in surrounding areas and apply it to the situation in Austria. So I think from memory that we had a chapter on models of policing, which was the nice theoretical framework that set us up by looking at the different types of models, not just intelligence-led policing, but also problem-oriented policing, community policing, for example. Then went on to look at intelligence-led policing more specifically, then looked at the Austrian situation, and the final chapter then applied what we knew about intelligence-led policing from other countries to the particular issues and problems of Austrian policing to see whether an intelligence-led policing approach could be successful. So when students sometimes think there isn't a literature in that area, that's fine. You can combine other areas and then move the agenda forward that way without doing primary research.
Absolutely. I think actually that reminds me of a conversation I had with a student this week about some of these issues, where she said to me that she's doing a dissertation on the victimization of homeless people, particularly whether it's a hate crime or not. And she was saying to me that there doesn't seem to be very much literature specifically on that issue. And actually, it kind of helps to think of that as an advantage in some ways, because you can then make the links with the existing knowledge elsewhere to the problem in hand yourself, which can actually be really quite creative.
Absolutely, and show innovation as well, which is great. Whereas if it's an area that's a well-trodden path, not only have you got enormous amounts to read, but sometimes it can be quite difficult to say anything different or new.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, shall we do one more?
One more.
Okay.
I'm getting away with it, I think.
Because you are getting away with it. Okay. Lone actor terrorism in the UK, France and Germany.
Okay. Lone actor terrorism in the UK, France and Germany. This could lend itself to a case study approach.
Yep.
As soon as I see other countries, I think you could either do a comparative thing or you could actually do a case study. So you would need a chapter on terrorism, which would either then narrow into a chapter on lone actor terrorism, or you'd have a separate chapter on lone actor terrorism. So you start broad terrorism, then lone actor terrorism. You could then have a case study on one or two or even three of those countries, UK, France and Germany, and then your last chapter could then offer suggestions, reforms, how it's worked in some countries, how the terrorist legislation and policies could be applied differently to other countries. You could do that in your final chapter. So if you're looking at other countries, you can do a case study approach.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good. Okay, so we have talked about a number of different issues, and actually these are the kind of conversations that a student will be having with their supervisor.
Yes.
So let's broaden that out a little bit then. What is the role of the supervisor?
Well, we talked about how important it is early on, and that's absolutely vital. So that early contact to agree the principles of what you're doing, the research question, the aims, the objectives, the chapter structure. Because I think sometimes once students have got, well, chapter 1's this, chapter 2's chapter 3, they're much more confident then about the process, because in many ways it's about putting those chapters together then. But also importantly to remember that you can send draft chapters to your supervisor, and that's so important, isn't it?
It is.
We've both been in situations where someone sent us a whole draft dissertation a week before the deadline, and there's really not much we can do to help at that stage. But if we see chapters as students are going along, bear in mind our distance learning students will often be doing their dissertation for 18 months.
Yeah.
We see a first chapter, we can provide feedback, students can go away and then have a think about that and maybe alter that chapter a bit. We can do the same with each of the chapters, and then we can see a draft of the whole thing. So regular contact with your supervisor, personally, I think will increase your mark quite considerably.
Absolutely. I think it's also really important, from my view as a supervisor, to agree dates for draft submissions. So you agree some series of dates in advance, and it gives somebody something to work to. Because if you're going for a long time on a piece of work and the actual submission is some distance away, it becomes quite easy sometimes for other things, almost anything in some cases, to become the more attractive option.
Absolutely.
So if you've got deadlines that you've set in your mind and in your diary with your supervisor, that allows them to manage their time and allow them to free up their diary to give you your feedback, but also it staggers the process. So I think that's really quite useful.
And that's why those early conversations are really important, because you can set those parameters, can't you?
Yes.
How do you prefer to be contacted? You know, how do you prefer to receive your feedback? Should we do a phone call or a Skype or however you want?
Yeah, and be flexible and just have a conversation with your supervisor, and they'll be flexible too.
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
make sure that you're all on the same page right from day one. Okay, so last question then.
Yes.
The most important perhaps. What makes a good dissertation?
What makes a good dissertation? Oh, well, we've covered quite a lot of this already, I think, haven't we? But really clear aims. That's so important.
Yeah.
If anyone just listened to Gordon's session just now, talking about if you got onto a train and there was no announcement about where it was going, where it was stopping, what time it might arrive, then you'd feel a bit disconcerted. It's the same, particularly with a long piece of work like a dissertation. Make sure your aims and objectives are really clear at the outset and that you repeat them. So as a student, you might think, I've just told you my aims 3 pages ago. Your reader does not think that. You know, your reader is not as immersed in your dissertation as you are. So keep reminding them, signposting, clear signposting all the way through. You've got to show really good awareness of the literature. There's no getting away from that. And your supervisor will know if you haven't covered not only the most recent publications, but also the classics in the field as well, from the, some of the original pioneers in that area. So that's really important. A clear structure, signposting as I mentioned, no errors, and not too much cited in somewhere else.
Yeah.
You know, if it's important enough to be in your dissertation, then try if you can to find the originals.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. Looking at the original sources is really important because it demonstrates, first of all, an engagement with the literature, doesn't it? But if you're reading a textbook that talks about somebody else's work, then what you're doing is you're interpreting somebody else's interpretation of the work. So we're much more interested in your ideas and your thoughts about the original work that's been examined.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, of course, a really strong conclusion as well. Remember that, your introduction is the first thing that your marker will be reading, your conclusion is the last thing. Make it powerful towards the end. Too often I see conclusions that just sort of dribble away at the end, and you think, you've written a really powerful long piece of work here. Make sure you've got a powerful concluding statement.
Yeah, I find with sometimes with my students, I think it's quite useful to have a paragraph or two at the end that almost explains what you know now that you didn't know before.
Yes,
so you round it off by saying, actually, I started off trying to find this out. Having looked at all this and examined all this information, I've now found out X, Y, and Z, and that, I think, just gives you that powerful ending to say, look, I've found something here, I've achieved something.
And it reminds your reader as well, because your reader's not going to remember all of your 10,000 words, but
if
they could have 2 or 3 key points mentioned right at the end, so that then an hour later if someone said, oh, what was Johnny's dissertation about, you could say it was about this, and it found this.
Absolutely.
So be kind to your reader, I would say, and keep reminding them what you're doing and reminding them what you found at the end.
And get somebody to proofread it for you if you can.
Yes, this is where members of family are very useful. So sit them down
with
a coffee.
At graduation, they'll have a nice day out, so this is what they earn for.
Exactly. Read through all of those drafts as well. Many thanks, Nathan.
Pleasure.
That was very helpful.
Pleasure.
And hopefully there's some good tips for students there about the dissertation planning stage.